We continue today our September and October sermon series on dynamic discipleship. Today we consider at least part of what it might mean to be faithful disciples. So at the beginning, I will just clarify what I mean by disciples. Very simple. Those who follow in the way that Jesus has shown us to live. Discipleship. Faithfulness, steadfastness, being true to the way of Jesus, staying steady, daily, in the moment, dynamic discipleship, being faithful disciples. Jesus said, whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you true riches? And if you haven't been faithful with whatever belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? Just before Jesus makes this challenging and somewhat confusing proclamation about faithfulness, he tells a story, as he's wont to do. He tells a parable. Jesus taught about the realm of God and God's values by telling these stories, which aren't exactly allegories, but in which sometimes, most of the time, one character is God. Another may represent the actions of those in his time, such as, say, Pharisees. Another may represent the plight of those who need God's love and care, those who are on the outside, excluded, lost, like last week's parable, you remember, of the lost sheep and lost coin. Now, just a question, just kind of a touchstone here. Did you understand the parable that Kate just read? Kate didn't, did you? Yeah, neither did I. And wouldn't you know, as fate would have it, when we consider the most challenging and most confusing passage in all of the Gospels, the conference minister comes to visit. So, there you are. So we will, I know, we just forge right ahead. Some scholars think that this parable is so difficult to interpret because Jesus may have taken like a current event, something that had just happened in the community, and reinterpreted it in light of who was listening to make a point. So all of the details just don't quite fit. In addition to this not being a simple allegory, this passage also appears to have some kind of tangential remarks, sort of tagged on later as maybe the moral of the story, like you can't serve God and wealth. And so these things that may have been later additions to the text complicate our reading of the story and our trying to figure out what it might mean to us, what clues we might have about what it means to be faithful to the way of Jesus. So, just to relieve you, we are not going to discover the original meaning of this text today or even clearly explain most of the phrases. But what I do hope is that we will find this morning a word from God about living faithful lives, about being faithful disciples who can discern best, or at least good ways, how to follow Jesus and how to offer God's life and hope and grace faithfully in our lives. So, here's the story. A rich man hears that the manager of his farming business has somehow, we aren't told, has somehow been squandering his property, the rich man's property. Now, we're never told if these allegations are true or not, but the rich man immediately takes action and fires the manager, possibly to protect his own reputation. But before the manager is completely out on the streets, the owner tells him to act on the owner's behalf to settle the accounts with those who are still in debt to the owner. Well, the manager knows he's in trouble. And so he's going to take an opportunity. He's lost the only job he's qualified to do, and now his ability and integrity are probably also in question. What in the world will he do to survive? So he has a clever idea. At least perhaps this scheme might get some people on his side. So rather than suing the rich man for slander or sinking into a deep depression, he puts this shrewd plan into action. He sets out, bills in hand, approaching each debtor, and says, "Here, quickly, lower the amount on your bill. You can pay the rich man less than you owe." The debtors would probably assume that the manager was acting, as he did, on the rich man's behalf. So the rich man's reputation improved. He's now seen as generous and kind in the community. Plus, the manager, I'm sure, hopes that he might just redeem himself in the eyes of the rich man and be reinstated to his job. But if all else fails, he will at least make some friends and may not be sleeping on the street. This is where it gets interesting. The rich man hears about the manager's strategy and praises him. The manager may have kept his job, we don't know. The manager is described in different translations as dishonest, shrewd, and maybe the least thing he was self-serving. The shop continues. Jesus praises this manager too. The one who's called dishonest and shrewd. What in the world is going on? Now, we just don't know enough to know exactly what point Jesus was making. But we do know that he was praising the manager for faithfulness. Faithfulness in something, to something. We don't know if the manager was really squandering or if the steward, if the manager was forfeiting his own share of the profits when he lowers the creditor's debts. He may have been doing that to buy himself goodwill. But he was being faithful to something. To what and to whom? Let's back up just a little bit. We're in the Gospel of Luke. This is year C in the lectionary cycle, and a lot of our readings, this series of readings, is from the Gospel of Luke. And Luke seems to talk a lot about economy, about economics, about rich and poor, about having and giving, about selfishness and generosity. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus' ministry begins with the vision of Isaiah, which spoke of the good news being proclaimed to the poor, announcing the year of Jubilee. That's when the people of Israel were to be released from their debts. It's in Luke's Gospel that we have Mary's song, that Magnificat, that talks about the mighty being brought down from their thrones and the poor being exalted. Luke's audience, in Luke, Jesus' audience, is comprised of two polarized groups in regard to economics, among other things. We have on one hand tax collectors and sinners, those who were excluded and even demonized. And on the other hand, we have Pharisees and scribes. The wealthy Pharisees, the by-the-book Pharisees, the religiously good Pharisees, insulted Jesus by saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." But even in the face of this critique, Jesus continues to align himself with the poor and outcast rather than the wealthy and powerful. Jesus then offers parables continuously through the Gospel of Luke about lost things, about finding all that is valued, a single coin, a sheep, setting up the principle of God's economy. Now think about this, God's economy, where things have value based on very different things. Where generosity, for example, is more important than accruing wealth. Where little was more important than much. Where the outsider was more important than the insider. God's economy. What makes things worth something? Today's parable is in this center. And it's set up so that the audience, now who's the audience? Outcasts, sinners, Pharisees, and scribes. The audience thinks they know what the moral of the story will be. We think we know who the bad guy is here. But then Jesus seems to hold up the shrewd manager as an example of how one should behave. The manager seems to be, at the very least, irresponsible with another's wealth. You see, the role of the manager, as you would imagine, was to collect rents and manage trading. He was the trusted middle person between the landholder and the merchants and tenants. So if he was able, in the deals, to negotiate more for himself, that was fair. The landowner expected it, that was the system. And so the poor paid more. The middle person skimmed off some, but the bottom line had to be that the rich got richer. Perhaps in this story, this manager was acting as if what belongs to whom is to be overturned, is irrelevant. The world of debts and debtors was a poignant one for Jesus' day, as we know it is for ours as well. But Jesus knew how this oppressive economic system worked and how the few rich controlled the poor. But what does he teach about? Jesus teaches about the realm of God, the ways of God that he proclaimed, which were meant to be good news for the poor, to bring blessing to those who were excluded. Those are the principles of God's economy. The system wasn't working. So perhaps the manager thought it's time to turn the tables over, to change economic principles, to act up for economic justice. Remember, he's listening on both sides. Not only rich and poor, but rich who took advantage, who extorted the poor for their own selfish gain. As his critics, the Pharisees could hardly bear Jesus' audacity, not only in this, but in all the ways that he lived. He spent time with those people. He took their side. He healed them, restored them, forgave them, made them think that they mattered. Only God could do that, they said. He's dangerous. Perhaps in our story, perhaps Jesus is the manager, squandering hope and healing at every turn, suggesting a redistribution of wealth and a redefinition of who gets what, faithful to the insignificant in the world, faithful to God's values, serving God rather than the economic system. Jesus, the faithful disciple of God's justice and grace. Perhaps Jesus is the rogue, the one they accuse of being unauthorized to forgive debts. And perhaps the owner, God maybe, will approve his radical generosity. Jesus is God's agent of forgiveness of debt, who rights the system shrewdly and faithfully. In his own setting, in his own religious economy, Jesus' behaviors were outrageous. His opponents were saying that he had no right to go around welcoming sinners and declaring God's forgiveness to them. They denied Jesus' authority to do so, but he's faithful to the love of God in the world. And so maybe, just maybe, Jesus is showing us through the scandal of the manager how to boldly take it on ourselves to overturn the economy with radical generosity. And so he makes the pronouncement: you cannot serve God and wealth. Not God and money. God and the systems of retaining wealth or leaving wealth in the hands of the few. You can't serve both systems. Worship of wealth, accruing possessions, is antithetical to the economy of God's realm. This was for them and is for us an economy that enslaves both the wealthy and the poor. neither they nor we can be faithful to God's economy of generosity and the economy of building wealth with greed or withholding from those in need. Church, us, we cannot be faithful disciples to both generosity of grace and the proprietary privileges of excluding those who aren't like us, who have less than us. And so in light of this story and our little interpretation of it, are we faithful disciples? Are we faithful to the values and economy of God in how we live as a congregation and as individuals? Are we faithful stewards who insist on justice and generosity? Faithful to giving away as much grace and hope as we can to those who need relief? God's riches and grace and love need to be given away, not closed within the doors of a church, not even closed within the doors of our own hearts and lives. We might just start to believe that they're only for us, for insiders only, unless we follow the shrewd manager's way. Come up with a plan to give it away. So what are we going to do with this parable? How can we apply it? How might we hear in it a word of God for us? Is Jesus leading us to be faithful disciples of God's economy in squandering and offering equality, invitations to the table? Is he suggesting that the church and each of us is to be a faithful agent, each of us, of God's riches? Are we faithful in what belongs to another? That is the grace of God. Are we faithful in what belongs to us? The love of our hearts to give it away. I think Jesus would say that we too can give out those gifts of God. Forgiveness, grace, God's favor. We can invite others to the table of grace. We can offer prayers for and with anyone. Being a faithful disciple of this Jesus, the one who is more like Robin Hood than a dutiful accountant, means that we take the riches of God and lavish them foolishly, squander them recklessly every day and all around, in our work, in our homes, in our neighborhoods. We look for places where we can be extravagant. So once again, every valley can be exalted, every mountain and hill be made low. We're to take God's favor as our own and give it away. You see, being a faithful disciple of Jesus doesn't just mean reading our Bible and praying and coming to church, or even generically having goodwill toward God and others. Rather, faithful discipleship means that we open our eyes to what doesn't comply with God's economy in this world of equity and radical grace. And then we work smart. We know the system and we work smart, shrewdly even, to make it right. At the beginning of this story, all the relationships were pretty broken. The owner is ready to fire the manager. The manager is terrified. Many are in debt. But after the manager's shrewd plan, good abounds. Debtors were relieved. The manager wins friends. The rich man was seen as generous and forgiving. So at the end of the story, relationships are reconciled, debts are canceled. That sounds an awful lot like Jesus to me. Now it's our turn, faithful ones, to make it right by taking the riches of God that we know and handing them out gladly. To be faithful to God's values and God's economy, to the people that Jesus lifted up. This is a hard saying. It's a hard parable, and this isn't even close to the whole truth of it. But we may have a key to faithful and dynamic discipleship. May it be so. Amen. This challenging and somewhat confusing proclamation about faithfulness, he tells a story, as he's wont to do. He tells a parable. Jesus taught about the realm of God and God's values by telling these stories, which aren't exactly allegories, but in which sometimes, most of the time, one character is God. Another may represent the actions of those in his time, such as, say, Pharisees. Discipleship, being faithful disciples. Jesus said, whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you true riches? And if you haven't been faithful with whatever belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? Just before Jesus makes be faithful disciples. So at the beginning, I will just clarify what I mean by disciples. Very simple. Those who follow in the way that Jesus has shown us to live. Discipleship. Faithfulness, steadfastness, being true to the way of Jesus. Staying steady, daily, in the moment. Dynamic. Another may represent the plight of those who need God's love and care, those who are on the outside, excluded, lost, like last week's parable, you remember, of the lost sheep and lost coin. Now, just a question, just kind of a touchstone here. Did you understand the parable that Kate just read? Kate didn't, she? Yeah, neither did I. And wouldn't you know, as fate would have it, we continue today our September and October sermon series on dynamic discipleship. Today we consider at least part of what it might mean